Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the last session of the Humanities Festival. It's a pleasure to welcome my colleague from Geneva, Professor Vinh-Kim Nguyen, who is both a practicing physician and a social anthropologist. He is a medical anthropologist and an expert in the field of public health and global health. The topic we're going to address with him today is one on which he has been doing research of late. He has been working on various infectious diseases the last few years with the ERC grant on Ebola and on HIV/AIDS in West Africa. So his research focus has been for many years infectious diseases. The two books actually, for which he's very well known. One, The Republic of Therapy, addresses the whole question of the changing nature of sovereignty, triage, in the way community organizations have had to take charge in West Africa of coming to terms with the HIV epidemic. The other book, which is a minor classic, it came out in 2010 in the second edition last year, or this year, 2018, An Anthropology of Biomedicine, is looking at biomedical technologies and the body as sites which are not only shaped by our genetic makeup and their interaction with technology, but making a very powerful argument about why the body is not something which is universal, as biology would have us believe, but is a malleable entity. And the work which we are going to discuss with him today is on wounds, war wounds, more particularly in the Middle East, or beginning in the Middle East, the so-called Iraqi bacter, looking at how certain kinds of, what is the power of these bacteria, which are highly resistant to antibiotics, how these bacteria have traveled, so their global diffusion, and what does it really mean for a looming problem which we need to address in the field of public health. So what I'm going to do is to ask him to give us a short introduction to the topic, and then I'll discuss various aspects of it which, as a non-medical person, have interested me.
So thank you for inviting me, and I think the first thing that I should say is that this is a very sort of exciting and sprawling project that is very much a collaborative one. So I'm the one who's here in front of you, but virtually behind me is a whole community of researchers and physicians who have been drawn into this problem. In Syria, in the wake of the wars in Iraq and lately in Syria, some of them who have been unfortunately assassinated in Syria, as you know. So it's very humbling to be able to be here in front of you. The story is at once, I'm going to tell it in a very simple way, which is that in the simplest way possible, which is that in 2008, or roughly around 2008, American military surgeons started noticing that many soldiers returning from Iraq had these wounds that wouldn't heal, and in fact found that they were wounds that were infected with a highly resistant strain of bacteria, which is quite an unusual bacteria to find in wounds, and it's got a rather amusing name. It's not an amusing bacteria, but it's got this name, which is Acinetobacter baumannii. Acineto meaning motionless, because it doesn't have a little flagella, it doesn't have a little tail to push it around. Baumannii after Baumann, the discoverer. So because this bacteria, this drug-resistant bacteria was described in Iraqi veterans, it was called Iraqi bacter. But since in the last 7 or 8 years, Iraqi Bacter, although we don't really call it that anymore, but I will here, has become a global problem. It disseminated from, it spread at the Landstuhl Hospital in Germany into Afghan veterans, and it has disseminated into the general population. In other words, we are seeing little outbreaks in non-veterans and all over the world increasingly. So we got involved because we started, so my colleagues Omar Doechi and Hassan Abu Sita, who are, Omar's a medical anthropologist and Hassan is a surgeon in Beirut, started noticing this infection in the people they were treating there for various war wounds, initially Iraqis and increasingly Syrians. And throughout the region, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've become very sensitized to, we being the community of doctors who treat these patients, to the extremely high level of infection with these highly resistant bacteria in people who've been wounded in the conflicts. I was just in Palestine in July, in Gaza, in Gaza. There are some patients who have who are infected with bacteria that are resistant to all known antibiotics. So we're really dealing with a very serious problem which can have a global spread. And this project has all been about investigating where this comes, what's causing this resistance, and where, what's causing it, and what's the future, what does it hold for medicine more globally.
So two questions, just so that I understand this. So in the beginning, this was a bacteria which was noticed in the wounds which soldiers had. And of course, that already is a vector of spreading it, because these soldiers were not necessarily being treated in Syria or in Iraq, but in American Army hospitals in Germany, or even back in the United States.
Yes, so the VA hospital system in the US, the Veterans Administration hospital system, treats an mainly civilian population.
Mainly civilian population?
Mm-hmm. Well, ex-soldiers, but also families, people. I mean, the military is kind of a big undertaking in the US, so it gathers a lot of people.
Right. So this is one kind of spread, but what I understood by reading some of the work of yours or your team that I've seen on it is that the other spread is through what one could call medical migration, as civilians from these areas also migrate and then come to Lebanon for treatment, or even go to India, so that it's not something which can be controlled in a military hospital environment, where probably the hygienic standards can be maintained to isolate these cases, but that this is the beginnings of probably a much larger global spread of the bacteria. Is this right?
So that's what we initially thought, but it's become, the story is actually quite fascinating and more complicated in a way. So we do know that bugs get spread within hospitals because very sick, immunocompromised people are cared for by doctors and nurses, and they're spread inadvertently by, when we don't wash our hands. That's kind of the stereotype. So now, at the hospital where I work at, there's actually a security guard in front of the ward who checks to make sure you wash your hands and that you change your gown and so on and so forth. But and then we thought there's not much evidence that, so it's a bacteria in this case which has to be in a wound. It doesn't appear to travel just on the bodies of people. That being said, we've been hampered in our understanding because we're I don't know what the term I want to say is we're species-ocentric when we think about this phenomena. We think of bacteria as organisms. It's sort of an anthropomorphism. You know, you have, oh, there's the E. coli's, there's that tribe, there's the Klebsiellas, there's, you know, we have these different bacteria tribes, and this is how we understand how infection works. Well, in fact, antibiotic resistance is generated by genes, and bacteria, I bet you didn't know this, but bacteria have sex. They're constantly exchanging genes in various ways through all kinds of, I'll spare you the anatomical details, but there are different mechanisms by which bacteria exchange genes. So in fact, the phenomena of antibiotic resistance has a lot to do with the broader ecology of different where bacteria live in the environment and in the environment. So if you've ever had an infestation of pantry moths, you'll understand that, you know, it's that one bag of rice or something which is invisible, right? Is you're not cooking with it, right? You're cooking with your flour and your eggs or whatever. But in fact, deep down in some drawer, you have a reservoir of infection, which is a bag of rice or... And we think increasingly what we've been led to think by looking at the evidence is that Acinetobacter, which as I said before, it's a very unusual pathogen. It's not found very commonly. As I said, they're isolated outbreaks. So in the hospital I work at in Montreal, we had an outbreak which killed 4 or 6 people, but they were very ill. They were in the intensive care unit, etc. And you know, we have these kind of little outbreaks. But we think that this bacteria is acting as an environmental reservoir, like the bag of rice in the bottom of the drawer where your mites are your moths are proliferating. It's a really, really great bacteria. I quite like it. It's immobile. It's like a fat, lazy bacteria. It's very, very fat because it's bloated with all these antibiotics. It collects genes from the environment. So it's a gene hoarder. It's very fat, and it makes it, you know, when you're big and you're carrying a lot of baggage, you can't move very fast, right? So its strategy for surviving is to carry all this baggage around so that when an antibiotic hits, it's the only one left standing, right? Because all the other slim, agile, virulent bacteria get killed off by the antibiotic. So this is why we think we're seeing it in the wounds, because these are patients who are being literally you know, inundated with antibiotics, and because it's got all these genes, it's the only one left standing. The interesting and somewhat scary thing is that there is evidence now that this, you know, we have to stop thinking in a kind of a species-ocentric way, right? So we see bacteria as humans, you know, in a way. They're organized in tribes, you know, they have different names, each bacterial tribe has its genetic makeup, and then you have a little miscegenation and, you know, sharing of genes and so on. But in fact, bacteria are ecosystems, right? They're biomes. And so when you think about it this way, it's maybe useful to think more about, let's say, termite hill, is that there are fast, deadly, quick, you know, slim, sharp bacteria, which are the ones we get, you know, E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, well, not less so Pseudomonas, but they're bacteria that cause infections in humans aggressively, but which are not very antibiotic resistant. And their strategy is to be sharp and quick. And then you have the lazy, fat, you know, kind of indolent bacteria, like Acinetobacter. But what they do is they're the kind of genetic library for the other bacteria. So these other bacteria go and source genes in Acinetobacter, which is how they get resistance. So there is some evidence that Acinetobacter actually acts as a clinically invisible reservoir of resistance, that it's there in the bottom drawer, in this case in the environment, collecting these genes. And of course, in this conflict, what we're seeing is that people are being wounded in ways where there is a lot of inoculation of soil and so on, where the bacteria lives. You've all heard of barrel bombs and wire and fecal material in the bombs and all this kind of horrible stuff. And what it does is that it creates very bad wounds with a lot of inoculation.
Two follow-up questions, just that I follow what is happening here. So on the one hand, when you say that this is a bacteria which is part, or we are finding it primarily in conflict zones, does this mean that...
In patients wounded in these conflicts?
Yes,
yeah.
Patients wounded in the conflicts. So does it just have to do with the kinds of, or the lack of the kinds of treatment available in hospitals in the conflict zones? So one possible understanding could be, yes, the fact that the health infrastructure collapsed in a lot of these countries, that part of the problem is that you had very few antibiotics with which you could treat people, so that it's a mix, now I'm thinking of the socio-economic environment and not the ecological environment of the bacteria. So is this a story about the destruction in war of medical health infrastructures, hospitals, lack of availability of medicines, and in the Iraq case, of course, the sanctions, which are also, for a long, long period, hit the country in a way that it restricted access to medicines? Or is it also, as you just described, a question of the destruction of urban infrastructure, contaminated water, sewages, other kind of pollution, or it's a mixture of the two? So what is the sort of war environment which...
So there's no, I get the question, and I think it's difficult to answer other than sort of more generally, because once again, these are nothing's been proven. So the question of sanctions in Iraq is an interesting one, because antibiotics were so limited, and it's not really clear if that would have contributed to or had the opposite effect in terms of antibiotic resistance. Usually we think of bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics because antibiotics are used too much rather than too little. I mean, to make or used improperly, shall we say. What I think the particularity of this conflict, if you compare with, DRC or some, conflict in Africa, is we have a war which has occurred in heavily urbanized areas, and that itself, as you mentioned, releases a lot, toxins into the environment. This is the first war, I believe, in human history where we have destroyed cities and never rebuilt them. So there's a lot of stuff just lying around, a lot of toxins. The second thing that I think is we have to keep in mind, that's another specificity, is that these wars have occurred in countries with extremely advanced medical systems. I mean, systems as advanced as Austria. So where the level of medical education is very good in Iraq, and there hasn't been a war in Iran, but these are, Syria. So people are extremely sophisticated about medicine. You have a large population of people with chronic illnesses, with cancer, with diabetes, and so on, who in Central Africa, these people are dead because there's no medical system to keep them alive. So you have a lot of people with chronic diseases, and you have a kind of tradition of using and having access to antibiotics. So when the war comes along, and with the economic consequences and the destruction of infrastructure, you have a lot of people wounded, and you have a lot of people accessing antibiotics whichever way they can, many of them substandard, etc. So you have a kind of antibiotic anarchy, where people are taking the wrong antibiotic or a counterfeit antibiotic. So you're getting just enough antibiotics into the environment and into the bodies that the bacteria take that as a signal, oops, I better get resistant to this one. Forgive the anthropomorphization. You have a real recipe for antibiotic resistance. I spent 3 months with MSF in Yemen, and it was very interesting to see the kinds of prescriptions that patients were being given in Sana'a for every antibiotic under the sun. And of course, when you're given a prescription for 5 or 6 antibiotics, you're not a doctor, you don't know which one to take. So you go to the pharmacist, and what you end up taking is kind of a balance between what's available, what's cheapest, what the pharmacist recommends, maybe what color the box is, and so on and so forth. So you get really, you get antibiotic anarchy. And the other thing I should say, which may not be obvious to people, is that if you have an infection with a bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics and you take the antibiotic, it will work for a while. And it will work enough to, in French we say, to decapitate the infection. The symptoms may go away because there's still some residual efficacy. But as you take that antibiotic, it kills off the bacteria that are resistant and the more that are not resistant, and the more resistant ones gradually take over. So the infection comes back, but it comes back weeks or months later. So we see it often in terms of bone infections. People suddenly, the pus starts leaking out of the leg because of an old wound that healed, but the infection just burrowed down and went into the bone and then comes back out. So I saw a lot of that in Yemen, for example. Yeah.
So that, the temporality is also over a period of time where you may not necessarily even associate it with an old war wound, but you are seeing infections which actually are related causally in ways which are not immediately obvious. So this is, but to go back to
I'll give you an example. In Gaza, there's about, when I was there in July, we estimated that there were roughly 1,600 people who needed limb reconstructions, who had lost more than 7 centimeters of bone. And we know that probably most of those patients will develop bone infections, at least half, but that it will take about 6 months. So you're going to start hearing about this in the next couple of months. I think it's going to become a big problem, that there's going to be roughly 700 or 800 people with bone infections or osteomyelitis, and these have to be treated with IV antibiotics, so they have to be treated usually in hospital, so it's going to be a big problem. But yes, there's a long lag.
I understand. But to go back to the war context, the question which I remember once discussing with Omar in Lebanon when I was talking to him was the question of the kinds of ammunition which is being used because of the heavy metals which are in the ammunition. So it's a connection which made little sense to me initially until he explained to me that it's not just even a question of the ecological environment of the bacteria or the built environment or the health infrastructure, but it's also a question of the kinds of ammunition which is being increasingly used.
So, Omar's research, when he was doing interviews with people in Fallujah and in Iraq, and this is a very interesting observation, is his informants often said, this war has poisoned us. It's destroyed the environment. It's caused toxicity. And it's an interesting thing to say because it's not necessarily the obvious thing you would say about a war. You could say, oh, the Americans were so terrible or they were so violent or something, but it was really one of the main messages he got was toxicity. And look at Mohammed's cousin has cancer and he's 23, and there was this kind of very strong, what I call ethnographic signal. And Omar started looking at, as you know, the Americans used depleted uranium in Fallujah. Heavy metals are heavy, so they're very good to put in bombs and so on, because they burrow deep, and when they explode, they spray and they cause maximum damage. The shrapnel really, invades, penetrates the body. So there's kind of a practical, if I can say that, advantage for heavy metals. And he started to look into this, and we found some literature that one study in Libya that showed that there was more heavy metal when they sampled, on the road surface where there had been combat than where there hadn't been combat, I think in Benghazi. And this is kind of something we kind of have always known. When you blow up buildings, you release heavy metals. The arms, the ordnance has heavy metals in it as well, but there's also an indirect effect just from destruction. But then we discovered a very surprising thing that very few people know, which is that heavy metals can cause resistance to antibiotics. So if the kind of mechanisms bacteria need to evolve to survive in the presence of heavy metals actually allow them to survive in the presence of antibiotics. So we're sort of wondering now, is there a connection? Is there what biologists would call a selection pressure exerted by heavy metals of the kinds found in ordnance but also released by destruction of built infrastructure? Is there an effect for the selection of antibiotics? There's many studies that have been done in Europe, and this is stuff that, the fun thing about this is that you start reading stuff that you never had any idea would have any connection about. So I know a lot about, well, I know more than I did about pigs, for example, and raising pigs. So pigs. Pigs are given antibiotics, and the antibiotics leaks into the environment. And so studies have been done in Switzerland, which is not the place you would associate with environmental contamination, looking at heavy metals and antibiotic resistance in the environment. Another one is aquaculture. So heavy metals are used in anti-fouling agents that prevent, the bark, that thing that gathers on boats with a bee. Barnacles, thank you, from accumulating. So there's all these different pathways by which heavy metals and or antibiotics leach into the environment and cause antibiotic resistance. Much of it having to do with raising pigs and chickens and so on, but also with sort of routine things we don't really think about, like anti-biofouling and so on.
So that's sort of brings us to halfway of our discussion. And I was just wondering, let me open up to questions from the audience, and then we can continue our discussion, because there could be people here who have much more technical competence on the matter than myself, and so they may want to ask you questions which are not on my agenda. So let me first turn to the audience, and then we can resume some of the questions I have at the back of my mind.
How do you fight these bacteria? Do you come up with stronger antibiotics?
So we don't have them. That's the problem. So so far, the only antibiotic that seems to work against most of these strains is colistin, which is a very old antibiotic from the 1950s that also causes renal failure, so it's not great. One of the interesting questions is, why do we not have antibiotics? And it's a very interesting question I've just started to look at, but what I've understood so far is that the pharmaceuticals industry is not coming up with new antibiotics, not because there's not a market, but because that market is much less profitable than other markets like statins or drugs to basically prevent chronic diseases. And that's driven partially by the financialization of the pharmaceutical sector. So we're dealing with a kind of a market failure, I think it's fair to say, when it comes to antibiotics. The gene we worried about is or the genes that are spreading and that are of the most concern and that have exploded worldwide in the last 10 years are ones that give resistance to carbapenems. So antibiotics with names like imipenem, ertapenem, meropenem. These are the last line. They're the extended 4th, 5th generation penicillins. It seems, and you see the problem is that when bacteria, it's like when you sign a contract for a cell phone or for your modem. Bacteria get genes in packages, right? So if they get a carbapenemase, they go, it's cheaper, it's a better deal. You get 3 or 4 genes for one evolutionary transaction. So this is the problem too, is that the resistance comes with genes bundled together, and they're often bundled together as cassettes. We call them cassettes. So when they have bacteria sex, they exchange these sets of genes together that give them full broad spectrum resistance. So it's not it doesn't look very promising. And of course the specter that haunts us here is that in 10 or 15 years we will have lost we will not have any antibiotics that work anymore, which means no more surgery. We return to sort of, we'll get no more surgery. We'll have, what makes modern surgery possible is antibiotics to control infection. Even childbirth will be more complicated. Cancer, we won't be able to use chemotherapy anymore because people will just die of the infections. So we're really, if it really gets to that, it really means there's a huge shift in what we're able to do with modern medicine.
Well, thank you for this really fascinating talk. Referring to your title, The New Bacterial Warfare, I think that this warfare is the kind of warfare that you're leading every day in hospitals around the world and in laboratories maybe, but you also made clear the close connection to war in the literal sense, namely that it originates there. But if I understood you correctly, this was not a highly resistant bacteria that was developed intentionally, but it just occurred under the circumstances of war because it has the ideal conditions to develop there. But how real is the danger of actually using it as a weapon? This would be the second meaning of your title, The New Bacterial Warfare. You could very easily think of a way to use this as a bacteriological weapon in future warfare. Is this a real danger, or is this just a fantasy imagination so far?
It would not. So in biosecurity, people, which is not my field, but I know that we look at pathogens that can be easily weaponized, and these are usually aerosolized, anthrax and so on, and so pathogens that can be spread very easily. This bacteria, as I said, it's clunky. It's kind of, it doesn't grow very fast. It is not a candidate, I would say, or the best candidate for weaponization. But what is very deliberate, and I have to insist on that, is the development of arms or of weapons that are meant to maim and injure. Rather, to kill, but as well to injure. And I think, I'm not a military strategist person, but it's hard not to see a deliberate attempt to, and the example of the barrel bombs in Syria, where human feces are put into them, it shows that this is a form of bacterial warfare, because they know what these bombs do is they create shrapnel, which is weaponized with fecal bacteria that will, penetrate into people. So I think there is a deliberate. It's the way people are harmed. What the weapons do, the wounds it's through the wounding, and not through the bacteria. That the wounding is the driver of the bacterial warfare, if you will, and not the bacteria per se. They're just, they'll show up for the party, as it were. You know, one of the things that I learned, which is very interesting, is that, well, maybe not, but if I'm not going to do it, but if I stabbed Shalini, and you know, in one shoulder, and I shot her on the other shoulder, where I shot her would get more infected. It seems strange because bullets are clean, right? But the chance of infection has to do with the amount of kinetic energy that's transferred into the body. So, because if there's more energy, right, something higher velocity, that, right, you know, energy, mass, you know, all that stuff that we learned a long time ago. If all that stuff, what it does is actually devitalizes tissue. So it means that it kills off a larger portion of tissue, which then serves as a medium for bacteria. I don't think this was thought out diabolically, but it's what is happening. So gunshot wounds and blast injuries are much more, yes, because of the level of transfer of kinetic energy. Crush wounds as well, because they cause a lot of devitalization. People actually, I don't know how they do it, people actually study this. There's a center for blast injuries at Imperial College, you know, where they just, I don't know if they just blow up rats or what they do all day, but you learn very interesting and rather morbid things when you study this.
About, I think, 80 or 100 years ago, there was also a separate branch of antibacterial with phages. Yes. And this is, and how do you see developing that right now with the loss of antibiotics effectiveness?
So phage is a kind of a virus that kills bacteria. So this is obviously a direction of research that people are very excited about. One of the things that, as an anthropologist, I think is worth pointing out is that our model of medicine is based on sort of targeting. It's a warfare model, right? So you have a risk, it's a cause and effect model. And cause-effect relationships can be very simple, but can be very easy to show for a handful of phenomena: smoking and lung cancer. High blood pressure and myocardial infarction. So we've had these early successes with cause-effect medicine, right? But you know, it's blinded us to the fact that there are much more subtle and complex and systemic interactions that can crystallize or not as disease. And when we see the potential end of antibiotics, it is a failure of a cause-effect approach to treating disease, right? Okay, we're just going to blast the cause, you know, and then the disease will disappear because it's the downstream effect. Well, increasingly, we know that doesn't work, because if you take out one cause, so if I prevent heart disease in the men in this room, they'll all get prostate cancer, right? I mean, sorry, that's a bit grim, but you know, it's such a simplistic model, right? That you have a disease ecology. The diseases are competing to kill you off, right? So if you and I think we're learning with bacteria, as you've all heard about the microbiome, and how many of you take yogurt with bifidus in it, and so on and so forth. We all know that there's a lot of complexity, and probably we definitely don't understand how bacteria produce human health and disease. We have a very simplistic model which works for some things, but the idea of taking out, and so my problem with the phage solutions, we're still in a cause and effect model, right? And there's a lot of evidence that as we have sanitized our environment, and as we have used, there's sort of what we call secular trends. So this is where you look over historical time in a population, whether something changes. So what we know is the more we've used antibiotics, and we've used that stuff you wash your hands with, Purell and so on, and the more hygienic our environments have been, we're seeing actually increases in autoimmune diseases like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, asthma, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that we need exposure to bacteria. We need dirt to, you know, to discipline our, you know, to make our immune systems healthy. And there's similar evidence from other areas. So my concern about phage is that we're not taking a systemic enough approach. But it is, you know, it's one of the ways we have to go, clearly.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed by this presentation, and a few things just shut up my mind. The one is, which is a minor one, is wasn't it that heavy metals was in the 19th century used to treat some infections before we had better means? That is the one thing, but that's not my main question. About 5 years before the invasion of Iraq and the situation which you discussed from infectiology point of view, there was an 8 years war between Iraq and Iran. And there were hundreds of thousands of casualties. Do we have any data if anything like that was registered?
So we looked at that. So the Iran-Iraq war is very interesting because, first, as I said, Iraq and Iran had very advanced medical systems. They had microbiology. They had very well-trained infectious disease doctors. And we actually went to the literature in Persian. And we actually tried to look, because one of the problems is, when I say this is new, 2008, the Americans, is it just because Americans, you know, they talk a lot, they publish a lot, they have a lot of money, they do a lot of studies, you know, and it was always there. So we're actually doing a historical study, and we don't find any evidence from Iran-Iraq war of multidrug-resistant Acinetobacter. But we haven't been thorough. We haven't gone to Iran and interviewed microbiologists, which is what we plan to do. There are some reports from the Vietnam War of Acinetobacter. Our methods of detection have changed over time as well, so there could be a bias there that we're not detecting it because we didn't have the methods back then. So part of our research is actually historical, and we're working with Hannah Landecker, who's a historian at UCLA, to look at that. And in fact, she was just telling me about what you said. So so a lot of heavy metals are used, neosalvarsan and so on and so forth, to treat syphilis, and she just wrote an email to me 2 days ago, but she was saying that she's trying to see if there's any evidence of bacterial outbreaks linked with the use of these heavy metal-based compounds. So you're absolutely right. And you know, mercury was in the 19th century, yeah, they were using all kinds of stuff. I mean, it makes my blood curdle when I think about it. But then again, 19th century is a pre-antimicrobial environment, right? So another little funny story. One of the theories is that, you know, this idea that our immune systems have changed because of antibiotics and hygiene, and so people want to look. Where you would see that is the microbiome, right? So you would want to see the ecology of the gut bacteria. So how do you get gut bacteria from the pre-antibiotic age? You need very, very old shit, right? And so there are latrines that people are digging up, right, that have been to sample the DNA. You know, this is crazy, the stuff people do. So people are very interested in this, you know, I was saying with asthma and so on. People are actually, it's actually a very serious topic, as it should be, of microbiology research. And we actually have fossilized microbiomes in old latrines in Europe, as well as dental scrapings can also be used. The technology is amazing.
Is it not a problem since some bacteria probably are more stable than others over the time, and then it's hard to say whether that's all the bacteria that there were or some just died?
Well, no, they're sequencing DNA. So remember, you've probably heard about these. There's these stories about, you know, they thaw out this. They've reconstructed the flu virus from 1917 in these cadavers that have been, so it's that kind of thing. So they have methods to extract DNA, and what they can do is compare sort of signature sequences to see if they differ. So the ability to do this research is, one, sampling and recovering old DNA, being able to amplify it, and then using an enormous amount of computing power to construct molecular family trees, because you have to analyze and compare these long sequences of genetic, of DNA strands, ACT, and then you have to compare, many different samples and reconstruct from where they diverge. So it takes an enormous amount of computing power, which we actually didn't have till about 10, 15 years ago.
So do you think that it's also possible then to see how these bacteria evolved over the last?
Yes, so that's what you do with the family tree. So basically, it's called phylogeny. So if I could sample all your DNA in this room, and I had a massive campus of computers, we could put in all those samples, and we could calculate back to how many generations ago you had a common ancestor, right? So this is the way we construct these family trees. By the degree of the more my DNA differs from Shalini's, the more distant our common ancestor. But these are statistical molecular techniques. They're not based on any kind of real life family tree. They're based on assumptions about rates of molecular evolution and statistical sampling and so on. So they're fraught in various kinds of ways. But they're a useful and provocative roadmap. So in fact, what some of us have been doing, for example, in the issue of where the Ebola epidemic started or the HIV epidemic, is you construct these family trees and you see if what the family tree is telling you is consistent with what you know happened at that time historically. So if you see a burst of viral evolution or a burst of genetic evolution, you know that these are usually associated with moments of social change or migration. Something has to happen socially to explain that biological event. So that's how you tie the two together.
I want to ask you a question about something that you mentioned on the site, and I hope I understood you wrongly, but did you say that in 15 years there will be no antibiotics that work at all? This
is the doomsday scenario, which I'm not saying, it's people like WHO who are saying it, and it certainly is plausible because...
Possible scenario if 15 years is a doom. I mean, what is the...
Yeah, end of the world, that stuff. You have Trump, and then you have... we just had Trump, and now you have... we should have had a panel on climate change.
If this is true, this will transform medicine, and
absolutely,
it will have very dramatic consequences for development of the world. So how plausible it is that this happens?
It is fairly... I would say there's a fairly good chance that it will happen eventually.
Why don't we hear about that?
Well, there's been a lot of there's been coverage. There's been stuff in the it's emerged as one of the top priorities. But it's like climate change. Why are we so bad at dealing with climate change? Maybe I'm not the specialist on why we're bad on dealing with climate change. But what I understand is that unlike Trump, it is a large, complicated issue. He's large, but not complicated, definitely an issue. And as humans, we're not good at responding to these kinds of very large, slow-moving, complicated issues. I think that's been my understanding of why people say we're bad at climate change. Antibiotic resistance is a similar problem. It's slow. It requires making very significant short-term sacrifices for hypothetical long-term gains, as you know. And there's another problem where it's a lot like climate change, is we have benefited from antibiotics. You and I, we've grown up healthy, we've had good medical care. So now we want to restrict antibiotics just at the moment where the majority of the world's population is poised to benefit from them, right? So climate change is the same thing. Climate change is saying to India and China, well, you can't have development because it pollutes, right? But we've had the benefit. So it's that kind of complexity you get with antimicrobial resistance. But it is a very, 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 I think it's pretty high on the agenda, and you're going to hear more about it. If you go to a hospital, and I'm sure it's the same in Vienna, you'll notice it because patients are screened, they're isolated. You know, we screen people now for these antibiotic-resistant genes, and we isolate them if necessary, and it adds a lot of complexity to hospital care. It's really gums up the system, and so we're quite aware of it. I think we're seeing it. But it's you know, it all has to do with understanding how these genes spread and how good they are at spreading across bacteria. So there's a lot of unknowns, but people, the pessimistic scenarios are 10 to 15 years.
So in this very scary context, are people asking questions about what possibility there is in Ayurvedic medicine or alternative medicines? Or are you saying that this environment that you're talking about is now, there's a global spread to this? Which really no other forms of medicine also may not have the answer.
Well, when I say that cause-effect, simple cause-effect medicine, which is Western medicine, may have run its course, in a way I'm nodding to not necessarily Ayurvedic medicine, but clearly there are much older established literate medical traditions in China and India, notably, that take this is where I become the anthropologist, but they take a much more cosmological, and you know, they're very similar actually to humoral medicine and to the medical systems that have dominated over human history, which are medical systems that locate the cause of illness in outside the body and in forms of imbalance of various kinds, to just gloss it that way. And you know, it's funny because they all share, you know, you have Qi and Chinese medicine, you know, the humors and humoral medicine, but conceptually, what is very different from biomedicine is the way they eschew a simple cause-effect relationship, right? It's all about balance, and it's the other thing that where they're very different, all these other medical systems, is that they see the illness in the individual as being highly specific to that individual, right? Whereas if you have a heart attack and I have a heart attack, it's the same disease, right? It's not individualized. And don't believe all this crap you hear about, you know, personalized medicine, because it's all based on this genetic kind of cause-effect, kind of very simplistic, mechanistic model, but that looks complex. I hope there's nobody from the Faculty of Medicine here, but anyway, that looks very sophisticated and complex because you can gather a lot of data and crunch it, right? But it's just if cause and effect is wrong or flawed, it's not by just adding more and more and more and more different cause and effect relationships and observing statistical patterns that you're going to get to something that's different, I think, personally. But we love personalized medicine because it involves platforms and big university hospitals and lots of money to pay researchers and, you know, that kind of stuff.
So is there something that we just don't get about bacteria and our bodies and how they interact, like the people in the 19th century didn't understand?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's what I'm saying, that the model we have for understanding what's going on is very powerful, but it has limitations. Maybe an example that would help is that if you get a pneumonia, or if I break your arm, right, these are very simple diseases, simple cause and effect, and we know how to fix them in biomedicine. But if you are depressed or you get low back pain, then or you're lonely, right? We don't have any model for, I mean, the low back pain is the classic one, right? Because everybody has low back pain. It's 80% of what you see in primary care, and we're just terrible at dealing with it, right? Because we don't have, in this case, we don't have a dynamic model of how the body works. Physiotherapists are much, doctors actually do not learn we learn the muscles by heart, we learn the bones, we learn what's attached to what, but we actually don't know how they make you move. We actually don't study movement, right? Other people study that. So there's all these blind spots in modern medicine, and I think this is what we're seeing here is perhaps one as well.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to know that if we take this cause-effect model, that's basically the if-then, okay? But this is what the computer is based on.
Yep.
Everything we program is if-then. So with this instrument to understand reality and to react, the more we use it, the less we seem to be able to sort of get the point, especially when it's not that simple a relationship. See what I'm saying? It's like...
I agree 100%.
Okay. Thank you.
It's exactly what I mean, I hadn't thought about the computer, but yes, I mean, that's what I was saying about personalized medicine, is that these algorithms, right, are they're very complex and sophisticated. Nobody can understand them, but all they are multiplications of very simple reductions. Yeah.
So this is, of course, a rather gloomy picture. I mean, Trump, at least one could get rid of in the next election. Mm-hmm. This doesn't sound like it's going away soon, but I just want to end the discussion with coming back to a point which you had mentioned, which is the financialization. Because one of the arguments you were making is the reason why we don't see better or newer antibiotics is that it's not very profitable to do it. What if one were to then say, okay, here is such an impending, serious public health crisis looming large in a relatively short time, because climate change is something which, it's not like a 10-year scenario which...
Oh, it is now.
It is? In that serious? I mean, here I have the feeling I know that it's serious, but the question is here 10 years, and this is, I think, what made Desi sit up suddenly. Say, you could, if you have children, you are, or even if you're thinking you could be around for the next 10 years, then it's sort of it's a time period which is really, for most people, calculable. And so the question would be, is it just a question of finding the money to invest in other systems, or the path is a very different one, because of what you've been trying to say is the limitations of a reductionist model of just thinking about health and illness? Because if that is the case, then no amount of putting research money into new antibiotics is the answer. We really have to think out of the box here.
My guess would be that incentivizing innovation in antimicrobials will certainly generate solutions, but if you understand how biology works, you understand that all the solutions are necessarily always going to be temporary, because, organisms evolve. So clearly we have to, go that way. But I'm increasingly thinking, when I look at this, the stuff around, what people are doing in epigenomics and microbiome and so on, I'm just wondering, shouldn't we be shifting the paradigm, right? And that comes out of my flaky anthropology side, perhaps a little bit, but also, you know, working in a hospital and seeing how limited our understanding, the way we measure quality of life is. I mean, you're all familiar, I think, with what we call, in Canada, we call them the levels of care directive, you know, where it's, if your heart stops, you do A, B, C, you start it, you don't start it, you call the family, you know, we have all these algorithms, and we also have these very, you know, simplistic ways of saying, well, you know, a situation I'm confronted with often in the hospital is you get, like the last, when I was last on duty was about a month ago, and I had 4 or 5 patients who were over 95, and they were all relatively healthy, but one, it was fascinating because one woman said, you know, I'm tired. You know, I'm miserable. I have pain everywhere. She had 3, you know, her 2 daughters and her son, who were like probably in their 70s, you know, were coming in every day. And she wasn't alone or unhappy, or, you know, she was just like, you know, enough already, right? And I said, okay. And she asked, because in Quebec we have medically assisted suicide, and there's a whole procedure for this. And she asked for me to start it, and then you'll laugh at this, because then, you know, it's still a hospital, so you have to consult, you know, and the medically assisted suicide doctor comes, he says, she's not eligible, she's not dying, right? Which was true. She was just old, right? And it was just fascinating, because I said, well, let's do palliative care. Let's not, you know, let's just make sure that Mrs. So-and-so is comfortable, you know, family, that's what she wanted. And of course, the minute the patient is told it's okay to die, she feels much better, right? She's in a much better mood, of course. But the fascinating thing is that you couldn't, if she doesn't have cancer and a disease like, you know, end-stage heart failure, end-stage renal failure, or cancer, we keep trying to keep people alive, even if it makes them miserable. Blood tests, you know, one day she had a headache, and the intern ordered a CT scan, and I almost ripped his head off. I said, why are you doing a CT scan, you know? So I think, you know, so part of where I'm coming from is this kind of frustration with the way our hospitals are, and I'm sure it's the same in Austria. I mean, it's the same in France. I've worked in France, the same in Switzerland. It's worse in Switzerland because the more you do, the more money you make. It's the system just doesn't, is the cause-effect model, just, it's endless, you know, you can't stop it, it's a machine. So that's my own rationale for, I guess, where I'm coming from and thinking, should we be looking at other models?
Other models of resolving this kind of a crisis. So thank you very, very much. I think this was a really radical stab at some of the questions of health and illness and prognosis, which are uncomfortable, but at least are opening out other ways of thinking about even the ends of life. And thank you very, very much for this conversation, and thank you for being here.